In July 2025, there was a Chinese man in Beijing, only known by his last name Leo, waiting for his delivery. You see, he had ordered a birthday cake for himself using an app called, no, not Temu, but Jingdong, which is better known as JD.com to the English-speaking world. We'll get to Temu a little bit later, but think of JD.com as China's version of Amazon. It's actually China's second largest e-commerce platform that had only entered food delivery in early 2025, just months before Leo ordered his cake. So when Leo heard the doorbell and realized his cake delivery had arrived, he was excited. Because from the listing photo, the cake was supposed to be this beautifully decorated cream cake with roses on top. Of course, Leo assumed that the roses were edible like any normal cake. Then he opened the box, and to his surprise, he saw that the roses on his cake were real, not the edible food-grade decorative kind, like literally actual flowers stuck directly into the cream. What would you do if you're in Leo's shoes? Some of you might be like, okay, this is a bit weird, but whatever, and just take out the roses and eat the cake. But Leo was not happy because he knew that roses could contain pesticides, which shouldn't be anywhere near the food you eat, let alone stuck directly into it. So he contacted the merchant and asked for his money back. The merchant said no. So Leo filed a complaint, like a simple consumer report to his local government office, probably expecting a refund or maybe a little fine for the merchant. But little did he know that his complaint would trigger the biggest food safety investigation in China's recent history. When the local regulator went looking for the shop that he ordered from, they couldn't find it, which didn't make sense because the app listing looked completely legitimate. Thousands of orders, glowing reviews, beautiful photos. According to the platform, the cake shop named Sweetword's Love Letter was a nationwide chain with 378 locations across China. But when investigators showed up at the registered address, nothing. No kitchen, no staff, not even a sign. Turns out, not a single one of those 378 locations existed anywhere in China. The business licenses were all forged, and the same fake license number had been copy-pasted across 10 different regional listings. In other words, the entire brand was a ghost. Over the next 10 months, what started out as a single consumer complaint in Beijing escalated into one of the most dramatic investigations in Chinese regulatory history. 7 government task forces, over 200 investigators pulled from across the country. We're talking a serious crackdown across every major food delivery platform in China that exposed a dirty industry practice known as ghost delivery at an epic scale. A shadow network of 67,000 fake shops, 3.6 million fraudulent orders. The result? Around 530 million US dollars in fines, with the biggest portion of the fine landing on the parent company of Temu, which somehow managed to make the whole thing even worse. Now, why should you care? Because this story isn't really about food. It's about something much deeper that most of the Western world does not seem to fully understand. Remember the whole controversy about lead paint in Chinese toys? The contaminated baby formula? For years, the West has held this negative stereotype about products coming out of China, and brands like Temu haven't exactly helped change that perception. But what if the real explanation is more systemic than just a cultural stereotype? What happens when competition and market forces get so brutal that somebody starts cutting corners without any regard for consumer safety? Because I don't think that's just a China problem. It's a global problem right now, and that's what we need to explore. But before we dive in this age of super convenient delivery services, think about how much personal information you hand over every time you place an order. Your name, your address, your payment details. You trust a platform to handle it responsibly, right? But as we're about to find out, these platforms might not be able to always vet who's on the other end of that transaction. And speaking of your personal data ending up in the wrong hands, right now an entire industry of data brokers, people search websites, and background check companies are quietly scraping the internet to build highly detailed profiles on you. And that's exactly where scammers and identity thieves go to buy your personal data, use it to impersonate you, open credit cards in your name, and steal your money. Imagine someone else taking out a loan under your stolen identity and you don't even realize it until it's too late. That's why you need Incogni, Incognito doesn't just remove you from data broker sites, they go way beyond that. Through their custom removals feature, Incognito targets the specific websites and platforms where your personal data is being sold and traded. They contact these companies on your behalf, demand your information be deleted, and actually verify that it's been removed. They handle everything so you don't have to spend months doing it yourself. Think of it as taking yourself off the internet, the same internet where your data is being bought and sold every single day without your permission. I actually use Incognito myself because of my relative public profile, and the results have been eye-opening. So if you want to protect your data from being exploited, try Incognito by scanning this QR code or using the link in the description. Use the code AsianBoss at incognito.com/AsianBoss to get 60% off an annual plan. That's 60% off to protect your identity and remove yourself from the internet. I highly recommend taking advantage of this offer. Now let's get back to the deep dive. To truly understand the scale of the competition when it comes to delivery services in China, I was wondering how far we needed to go back in our research because there are just so many players and we obviously cannot cover every one of them. But the truth is, for better or worse, the most well-known player outside China is Temu, which goes by a totally different name in China. So I thought this might be an interesting place to start. In 2006, a 26-year-old Chinese software engineer sat down for a very expensive lunch somewhere in the United States. When I say expensive, I mean crazy expensive. The lunch cost $620,000 US. In today's money, that would be about $960,000. Almost $1 million for a single meal. His name was Colin Huang, and he was brought along by his mentor, a Chinese-American billionaire named Duan Yongping, who paid for that much money to win a charity auction for the privilege of having lunch with a certain individual. That certain individual was none other than Warren Buffett, one of the richest men in the world, and arguably the greatest investor alive. Life wasn't supposed to turn out this way for Huang. He grew up in Hangzhou, China, as the only son of 2 factory workers. As a kid, he wore hand-me-down clothes from his mother's colleagues. But soon, everybody would find out just how academically gifted he was. He won a medal in a mathematics Olympiad, which earned him a scholarship to Hangzhou Foreign Language School, which was one of only 16 schools in all of China for academically exceptional kids. As a college student, he interned at Microsoft Beijing, where his monthly stipend as an intern was already more than both of his factory worker parents' earnings combined. Then he went on to get his master's degree at the University of Wisconsin and joined Google as an engineer the same year Google went public in 2004. And now here he was, sitting across from the legendary American billionaire. In Huang's own words, he was a phoenix soaring out of a chicken coop, a common Chinese expression for someone extraordinary rising from the humblest of beginnings. And what Buffett told him was so simple and so obvious that the lesson sat with him for nearly a decade. Buffett's whole thing was, if you apply common sense to a problem, the answer is usually staring you right in the face. The problem is that most people are too blinded by their own biases, too caught up in what everybody else is doing to see it. The lesson would go on to form the very foundation of his vision for a startup that Huang started in 2015 when he founded Pinduoduo. And in just under 10 years, Pinduoduo would go on to briefly surpass even Alibaba to become the most valuable Chinese e-commerce company in the world. So what's the difference between Pinduoduo and Temu? Honestly, not much. Temu is the international version of Pinduoduo under the same holding company called PDD Holdings. Now, here's something I've always found curious about Chinese companies with global presence. Why do they always separate their international version from their domestic version? You see the same thing with TikTok, which is just the international version of Douyin under the same parent company ByteDance. For video apps like TikTok, the reason makes sense. Because of China's censorship laws. If Douyin started allowing international content in, it would be nearly impossible to meet the domestic censorship standards. So ByteDance split the app into 2 versions, one for China, one for the rest of the world. But for an e-commerce app like Temu, censorship has nothing to do with it. One of the reasons is actually geopolitical in nature. By 2022, the writing was already on the wall for Chinese tech companies in the West. Huawei had been blacklisted from US networks. TikTok was already under fire from US lawmakers and regulators. So rather than exporting the existing Pinduoduo brand to the West, they created a new brand called Temu and incorporated it as an American subsidiary in Boston, Massachusetts. Multiple analysts have confirmed that this was a deliberate move to sidestep geopolitical scrutiny and build consumer trust with Western audiences, while the operations, the supply chain, and the ownership remain entirely Chinese. But another reason for separating out Temu was that Pinduoduo's business model simply does not work outside of China. Pinduoduo was built on this concept of group buying, meaning instead of shopping alone, you would recruit your friends and family to buy the same item together. The more people who joined, the lower the price dropped for everybody. And the way those deals spread was through WeChat. If you don't know what WeChat is, it's China's super app, which is like WhatsApp, Facebook, Apple Pay, and Amazon all rolled into one single app. Over 90% of China's 1.4 billion people use it every single day. So deals spread virally through WeChat groups, especially among older demographics in smaller cities and rural areas. But obviously, WeChat has almost no users outside China. So that entire model collapses the moment you cross the border. So Temu strips all of that away and replaces it with something simpler and more familiar to Western consumers. It just ships directly from Chinese factories to your doorstep in America or Europe, cutting out the middleman entirely. And yet, the name should tell you everything about where this company came from. The company says the name Temu comes from the motto "Team Up, Price Down," which reflects Pinduoduo's original roots of encouraging group buying. So to me, it sounds like Temu is an unusual acronym for Team Up. Except when you're shopping on Temu in the US, there is no teaming up. There is no group buying. So I guess the brand kind of got lost in translation there. But the price down or cheap part, that made it over just fine. And that obsession with cheap is what led Huang to found Pinduoduo in 2015. At the time, he looked at China's digital commerce world and saw two distinct categories of players. The first category was traditional e-commerce. In China, Alibaba was the OG, having been doing this since 1999. Think Amazon. You can order anything. Electronics, clothing, household goods, birthday cakes, and it ships right to your door. And then in 2004, JD.com entered the market. And by 2010, JD.com was already offering same-day delivery in China's major cities. The dominant players here were Alibaba and JD.com, essentially splitting China's urban middle class between them. But there was one thing that neither of them offered, something we now take for granted, but back then didn't even know we needed: hot food delivery. This created the second category of hot food delivery. Think DoorDash or Uber Eats, but on a truly giant scale. which literally means "Are you hungry?" in Chinese, was the first startup to crack this in 2008. Meituan followed in 2013. You open the app, order hot noodles or bubble tea, and a rider on an electric bike shows up at your door in under 30 minutes. By 2015, this was already a massive industry with tens of millions of daily users across China's major cities, and Meituan and had carved it up almost entirely between them. So that was the landscape, okay? Traditional e-commerce on one hand, hot food delivery on the other. And where Huang thought that Pinduoduo could fill a gap was in the first category of e-commerce. Alibaba and JD.com were mainly chasing premium brands and wealthy urban consumers in Tier 1 cities. The hundreds of millions of ordinary working people in smaller cities and rural areas, those who just wanted the lowest possible price on everyday goods, had been almost completely ignored. That was going to be Pinduoduo's market, and it worked beyond anyone's wildest expectations. Within its first year of launch, Pinduoduo had already crossed 100 million users. Within 2 years, it had sold more merchandise than JD.com managed in its first decade. 3 years from founding, Pinduoduo went public on the Nasdaq at a valuation of $24 billion, one of the fastest growing companies in internet history. And then in 2020, Huang stepped down as CEO and in 2021 as chairman, a full year before Temu launched in September 2022. So technically, Temu was launched under the new group CEO Chen Lei, but the philosophy remained the same: cheap above everything. Within months of launching, Temu became the most downloaded app in the US App Store. Americans who had never heard of Pinduoduo suddenly couldn't escape Temu. Things were going great, except at home. Because while Pinduoduo was focused on expanding Temu, the second category of food delivery services was exploding. The two main players that specialize in hot food delivery, Meituan and Temu, were completely dominating the delivery market with over 90% market share. And they were so successful that they started branching out to what's known in China as instant retail, basically fast grocery delivery on top of their hot food delivery. This was Pinduoduo's territory, and they started feeling pressure to go on the defensive. But why were Meituan and Temu so successful? Simple. People were opening their food delivery apps not just every single day, but multiple times a day. And now, besides getting takeout, they had the option to order groceries as well. Compare that to how often people open an e-commerce app to order a product. Not that often, right? Maybe once a week? In other words, this was becoming a battle for attention that traditional e-commerce players like Pinduoduo were losing out on, and they had to do something about it. In fact, other traditional e-commerce players like Alibaba had actually seen this coming years earlier, acquiring Temu back in 2018 for $9.5 billion US. JD.com launched its own hot food delivery service in early 2025. And Pinduoduo, feeling the heat on their home turf, committed over $1.4 billion to expand and defend their grocery delivery business in late 2025. So, are you getting the picture of how cutthroat the competition is in China? Suddenly, everyone was fighting on everyone else's turf. By 2025, the platforms were spending billions of dollars subsidizing food orders just to steal customers from each other. They were deliberately losing money on every single order just to win market share. One estimate put the total amount burned on subsidies at over 100 billion RMB. That's roughly 14 billion US dollars in a single year. Restaurants were getting more orders than ever, but making less money. Riders were delivering more food than ever, but earning less per delivery. And somewhere in that race to the bottom, corners started getting cut systematically, at a scale nobody had fully grasped yet, until one customer in Beijing filed a complaint about his rose cake. If you still haven't fully grasped how competitive the e-commerce market is in China, let me give you this additional fun fact. Amazon itself tried to crack the Chinese market for 15 years and eventually walked away with less than 1% market share. They were beaten by Alibaba and JD.com, and mind you, this was long before the current food delivery wars. China's e-commerce battlefield was simply too brutal, too fast, and too local for even the world's biggest retailer to survive. And when competition gets that brutal, it can create different incentives for players to try to get an edge. In this case, those incentives somehow converged on a shadow industry practice known in China as Yuling Waimai, or ghost delivery. It means exactly what it sounds like. When you order food on any of these delivery platforms, the shop you think you're ordering from may not actually exist. The official term for these fake storefronts is Yuling Dianpu, or ghost shops. You have no idea who made your food, where it was made, or under what conditions. Now, I have to make this quick distinction between ghost shops and ghost kitchens. Ghost kitchens, which also exist in many parts of the West, including the US, are perfectly legal. They are delivery-only kitchens with no dining space, which is a way for restaurants to save on rent and overhead costs. You can track their locations because they have legitimate business licenses. Ghost shops, on the other hand, are the fraudulent version. Fake storefronts with forged licenses, rerouting your orders without your knowledge to whoever will make the food cheapest. And according to our research, in the hot food delivery sector, ghost kitchens have also been around for quite some time in China. By 2021, Chinese media investigations were already reporting that roughly 1/3 of restaurants listed on major delivery platforms had no physical storefront, meaning there are a lot of ghost kitchens in China. Again, these ghost kitchens themselves are perfectly legal in China, as long as they have valid food operating licenses and real physical addresses. China's food safety laws require this regardless of whether a kitchen offers dine-in service or not. The problem arises when it comes to non-hot food delivery items like cakes and desserts, mainly because orders can be placed a few days in advance. That gives plenty of time for a ghost shop to quietly auction your order off to the cheapest unlicensed third-party baker nobody's heard of. Let me come back to how auctioning someone's order off is even possible in the first place, because there's a whole another hidden layer to this. Anyway, for now, the ghost shop here is the fake storefront that took your order. The one with the stolen food photos, the forged business license, and no real physical address. It never intended to make your cake. And the third-party unlicensed baker at the other end? Also illegal. So by the time your cake arrives, 2 separate illegal operations have touched your order and you had absolutely no idea. So who are the people running these ghost shops? As a matter of fact, who are these unlicensed bakers at the other end of the chain? We don't know. Based on the investigation reports, the ghost shop operators were deliberately designed to be invisible. Chinese regulators described them as having no fixed abode and untraceable as real persons, meaning they were opportunists who had figured out how to game the platform system to make money, setting up convincing digital storefronts, buying or forging the necessary licenses, and essentially running an arbitrage business from behind the screen. And the bakers? Investigators traced one order to a rundown residential building, like someone's apartment. Just ordinary people baking out of home ovens and no food safety certifications. Getting properly licensed as a cake producer in China requires a dedicated decorating room, commercial refrigeration, and passing hygiene inspections. Costs that these small operators simply could not afford. So they operated without licenses. And with only about $10 income they can make after deducting all the platform fees, you already know what kind of ingredients they were working with. For context, a 6-inch cream cake made with decent ingredients could cost about $8 in materials alone. Do the math. And here's the thing. We don't have to speculate about what happens when unlicensed operators make your food without proper ingredients or proper refrigeration. We have a real example. One that happened just weeks before Leo filed his complaint about the rose cake, and that shocked all of China. On May 20th, 2025, in Anhui province, which is about 4 to 5 hours south of Beijing by high-speed train, a local food influencer was selling homemade tiramisu from a street stall. She had over 10,000 followers on Douyin, where she marketed her tiramisu as pure handmade, no additives. People loved it. Lines formed. On that single day, she sold over 200 portions. But within 48 hours, nearly 200 of those customers got sick. High fever, vomiting, dehydration. The victims included students preparing for high school entrance exams, pregnant women in their 3rd trimester, and families hospitalized together. One family bought a tiramisu to celebrate a birthday and all ended up in the hospital. So what went wrong here? Temperatures that day hit 30 degrees Celsius, which is 86 degrees Fahrenheit, and the food influencer had left the tiramisu sitting in the open air from morning till evening. Tiramisu apparently need to be kept between 2 and 8 degrees Celsius, or 35 to 46 degrees Fahrenheit to be safe. She had also used regular unsterilized eggs to cut costs. Initial testing found bacterial counts 120 times over the safe limit, with a positive test for salmonella. And investigators found she had decorated some of the tiramisu with oleander flowers. I didn't know this until I looked it up myself, but oleander is apparently toxic to humans. After it went viral, the food influencer apologized publicly, then deleted her social media accounts and disappeared. To be clear, this person was not a ghost shop operator specifically, but she's exactly the kind of unlicensed small operator sitting at the bottom of the ghost delivery chain. Some cannot afford proper refrigeration or certified ingredients. Others don't even know they need them. They learn to bake from tutorial videos they found on Chinese social media, and they're making your food in conditions that will make you never order delivery again if you could see them. That's why food safety regulations exist. But did the delivery platforms, including Pinduoduo, really not know what was going on? Or were they in many ways incentivized to look the other way? None of them ever publicly admitted knowing anything about these practices, but one can reasonably infer It all comes down to the competition, the cutthroat competition, right? Take Meituan first. By 2025, even though Meituan held over 50% of China's food delivery market, JD.com entered the market with a disruptive strategy, offering zero commissions to merchants and rolling out massive subsidies. The move immediately shook the industry and triggered an all-out price war as platforms poured billions into discounts to compete for both the users and restaurants. In a subsidy war like that, the last thing you want to do is slow down your merchant onboarding to verify licenses. More merchants means more listings. More listings means more orders. More orders means being able to hold off a giant competitor like JD.com. JD.com is actually the most problematic because they were caught with the most number of ghost shops of any platform after entering the food delivery market. Over 43,000 ghost shops. Basically, they were the most desperate to catch up because they were starting from zero in a market dominated by a 50% player. In that case, you don't ask too many questions about the merchants knocking on your door. And then there's Pinduoduo. And their situation is honestly more troubling because competition alone doesn't fully explain it. Turns out, this wasn't their first rodeo with bad actors on their platform. Since 2018, Pinduoduo had been repeatedly investigated by Chinese regulators for counterfeit goods, pirated books, and fake quality inspection reports. As of 2023, they were still on the US Trade Representative's list of notorious markets for counterfeiting and piracy. So when ghost shops started popping up on their platform, it wasn't a new pattern. It was the same pattern playing out in a new category. The cheap above everything philosophy that made Pinduoduo so powerful also made it a natural home for anyone willing to cut corners to win on price. In case you want to argue that I'm just drawing inferences about deliberate and systematic malpractice on these platforms, and that the reality is that there are just some bad apples they couldn't identify out of hundreds of millions of orders, I said that's a fair pushback. But here's where it stops at being inference. Because when investigators looked closely at what these platforms had actually done, they found something very hard to explain away. Remember how I questioned earlier about how it's possible to just auction off people's orders to unlicensed third-party vendors? It has a name. It's called Zhuangdanbao, which roughly translates to order transfer package. It was actually a third-party app that functioned like a hidden stock exchange for food orders, running secretly underneath the apps you thought you were ordering from. What that means is that the moment your payment goes through, the Go Shop takes your order and lists it as an open auction on Zhuangdanbao, and all the unlicensed bakers are bidding to fulfill it. Whoever offers to make it cheapest wins. It's basically a hidden bidding platform that was making a fortune collecting transaction fees. Sort of like a hidden B2B platform, if you will. And here's the problem. Every single player in the delivery space, all 7 platforms, Meituan, JD.com, Pinduoduo, Alibaba's Taobao and Temu, the ByteDance's Douyin, and Temu, now rebranded as Taobao Shango, had independently signed formal cooperation agreements with Zhuangdanbao. In other words, these were deliberate business arrangements with signed contracts. The app was then built directly into their platforms so that Go Shop orders could be automatically rerouted with a single click. The official investigation found that all 7 platforms knew or had every reason to know that these arrangements violated consumer rights and chose to do nothing about it. That's how we ended up with 3.6 million fraudulent orders across those 7 platforms and 3.6 billion RMB, or roughly $530 million in total fines. In the words of a senior official leading the investigation, this was no minor violation. This was a new form of illegal activity that had become industrialized and scaled. Ideally, this is where I wish I could just wrap up the video saying everybody learned their lesson, cooperated with the government investigation to get to the bottom of the fraud, and accepted the responsibilities. I wish it was that simple, because that's not how things played out. There's a perception in the West, and I think it's a pretty widely held one, that when the Chinese government decides to crack down on a company, that's basically the end of the conversation. Everybody falls in line, no pushback, just compliance, right? That's not what happened here. On December 3, 2025, 6 months after Liu filed his birthday cake complaint, a team of investigators from China's State Administration for Market Regulation showed up unannounced at Pinduoduo's Shanghai headquarters. Think of them as the FTC and the FDA combined onto one powerful agency. Their job was to access Pinduoduo's transaction records, interview relevant employees, and review internal documents related to merchant verification and go-shop activities. Pinduoduo wasn't even the primary target. It was just one of 7 platforms being inspected simultaneously as part of a sweeping national food strategy campaign. They thought it was going to be another routine inspection. But as investigations worked late into the night, they discovered a restricted area within the office floor inside the building that employees were quietly leaving as the evening went on. When investigators tried to enter, Pinduoduo employees blocked the door. One investigator, an official named Guo Wei, had his hand crushed against the door by company staff, broken finger. The regulators called the police showed up and it still didn't stop. The following night, Pinduoduo's own head of security led a group that stormed back into the investigation site, shoved officers, and knocked Guo Wei to the ground. He ended up in the hospital with a head injury. In one of the most widely discussed moments of the raid, an employee was observed holding up a sign that read "Silence" and "Don't speak." When questioned, the employee reportedly crumpled the paper and ate it in front of investigators. This was late at night on a Wednesday at one of China's biggest tech companies. People just randomly eating papers. Anyway, following multiple instances of brawls, the government responded by stationing a task force of approximately 100 officials at the Pinduoduo headquarters to maintain order and ensure they could access transaction data, which Pinduoduo tried to block by claiming system upgrades or missing backups. By the end of the week, at least 3 Pinduoduo executives had been detained by police. Within 2 weeks, the company had fired 30 employees, including a co-founder named Fan Jiejin. When the fines were announced in April 2026, Pinduoduo received 1.5 billion RMB, roughly $210 million, the single largest individual fine in the history of Chinese food safety regulation. To put that in perspective, their competitor JD.com had over 43,000 ghost shops, which is far more than Pinduoduo's 9,463, and paid a way smaller fine because they cooperated. Pinduoduo, on the other hand, according to the official finding, repeatedly refused to provide relevant materials without justification, submitted false information, and used violent and obstructive tactics to interfere with law enforcement. So regulators had no choice but to assume that all 9,463 of their problematic shops had completed fraudulent transactions and applied the maximum penalty to every single one. That's the math of obstruction. So the obvious question is why? Why would Pinduoduo, one of China's most powerful companies, pick a fight with government regulators, knowing it would face serious consequences? Nobody knows. Their share price dropped to 6.5% as rumors of the fight began to circulate online, but the only public statement the company made was via a spokesperson to Nikkei Asia that this account was false and bore no relation to reality. That's it. No explanation, no apology, nothing. But one can reasonably speculate what was going on. Pinduoduo likely knew that their exposure was significant, not just the ghost shops, but also the signed cooperation agreements with Zhuangdanbao, the secret auction platform. And speaking of Zhuangdanbao, they got raided as well. After the fines were announced in April 2026, all 7 platforms were immediately ordered to cut off cooperation with them entirely. Strangely enough, Zhuangdanbao itself never got formally fined, but their app was pulled from official app stores, so their entire business model of being a shady middleman is effectively dead. Anyway, back to Pinduoduo, because here's the thing. This ghost shop scandal wasn't the first time they got caught doing something like this. Just days after their IPO in 2018, the same government agency that would find them in 2026 launched an investigation into widespread counterfeit goods being sold on the platform. We're talking fake TVs, pirated children's books, Infant formula selling for just $1 when the real thing costs $130. State broadcaster CCTV named and shamed them directly, warning that selling fake products was a line that no platform could cross. China's biggest publishing houses took them to court over pirated books sold at over 50% discounts, falsely labeled as authentic. The company's response? They said they were being unfairly attacked and maliciously targeted with negative press. Then they claimed to have removed 10.7 million suspicious items and shut down 1,128 stores in a single week. This was apparently good enough for the regulators because they didn't face a formal fine. In other words, they got away with a promise to do better, except they didn't get better. And their response to the latest scandal was to obstruct the investigation and receive the biggest fine in Chinese food safety history. And yet, even the $210 million fine is barely a rounding error for a company generating $15.4 billion in net profit. In other words, the fine represents about 1.4% of their annual profit. Just a drop in the bucket, really. So clearly, this whole pattern goes beyond simple competitive pressure or wanting to gain market share, although that's a big part of it. It's almost like the core philosophy that drives everything they do, being the cheapest option no matter what, ends up overriding every other obligation, whether that be moral or ethical. And I'm sure that wasn't the founding vision of the founder, Colin Huang, who built the company to serve the hundreds of millions of ordinary working Chinese people that Alibaba and JD.com were underserving, the factory workers, the farmers. But somewhere between that founding vision and a $54 billion empire after the founder's exit, something got lost. By January 2026, Chinese regulators had expanded their investigation into separate allegations of fraudulent shipping practices and tax violations. Then in early 2026, Pinduoduo was separately fined again, this time by tax authorities for failing to submit quarterly merchant tax data as required under the new 2025 platform regulations. But here is what I keep coming back to at the end of this whole thing. Putting aside what's actually happening to Pinduoduo, you cannot guarantee that more competition and the twisted corporate culture of each of these giant companies in a super crowded market won't produce more illegal practices and more victims. The ghost shop problem might have been resolved temporarily, but I'm sure there will be more shady practices popping up that will go unnoticed until real victims emerge in meaningful numbers. They're probably taking places right now as we speak. If anything, the economics that created the ghost shops haven't changed and will only get more cutthroat, which will encourage more cost-cutting behaviors. The consumer expectation of impossibly cheap, impossibly fast delivery will only get higher. So what are you supposed to do? Let me leave you with one last example of someone who pays the price of cheap every single day: the delivery rider. There are approximately 15 million delivery riders in China. They are the human infrastructure that makes 150 million daily orders physically possible. And the average rider earns about 63 cents per delivery. So if you work a 10-hour shift making 30 deliveries, how much do you earn? About 18 US dollars. That's less than $2 an hour. In September 2024, a rider in Hangzhou collapsed and died after working 16-hour days. His death sparked protest among riders calling for a union and an 8-hour workday. By most accounts, nothing fundamentally changed. And the reason why riders take these risks isn't necessarily recklessness. It's math. Meituan's algorithm for delivery riders, which the company calls Superbrain, keeps tightening delivery windows based on actual completion times. If most riders can consistently deliver in 10 minutes, the algorithm gradually cuts the standard delivery window from 12 minutes down to 10. If certain riders regularly finish in just 8 minutes, the system labels them high-efficiency benchmarks and raises overall performance expectations. What that means is if a rider delivers in 8 minutes, the next deadline could also become 8 minutes. Miss it and face the consequences. Negative reviews, reduced income, low priority for profitable orders, and potential suspension from the platform entirely. One writer describes the system as racing against death. This is what cheap actually costs. The bottom line is, the cheap has to come from somewhere. It comes from manufacturers running on margins so thin they cannot afford quality control. It comes from riders earning 63 cents per delivery, running red lights in the rain. It comes from bakers making your birthday cake for $10 in a residential apartment with questionable ingredients and no food safety certification. And perhaps most importantly, because of these realities and questionable practices, it's China's reputation at large that suffers on the global scale. We all know the Western stereotypes associated with made in China labels or Temu being the butt of many jokes. China's solar panels, which now accounts for over 80% of global supply, and its EV batteries are genuinely world-class products that still get overshadowed by past scandals like cheap fake goods, contaminated baby formula, and lead in children's toys. When you mess with people's health, that stuff really sticks. I'm just saying, if there's anything I've learned from researching this industry, it's that China's ghost shops and ghost delivery scandal isn't really a story about China's dishonesty at a national level. It's a story about what extreme competition and a misguided corporate culture does to any system when the only measure of success is how cheap you can make something. In fact, what was most surprising for me was the way these big Chinese tech companies are increasingly acting in a way that suggests they don't really fear the Chinese government as much as the West makes them out to be. How else can you explain Pinduoduo's repeated violations of regulations, and in the end, still walking away with a fine that's supposed to be punitive, but amounts to barely 1% of their annual profit? What's going on there? Are they too big to be punished now? What does that mean for consumer safety, not just for China, but for the rest of the world? This should make all of us very uncomfortable as consumers, especially because it's really hard to figure out how they should be held accountable. If you found this video insightful and feel like you learned something, the only thing I'd ask is that you subscribe to Asian Boss and turn on the notification bell. Because the YouTube algorithm tends to prioritize more recent entertainment-focused content, you might not see our new videos when we upload, even if you're a regular viewer. We put a lot of time and effort into our research and storytelling, even though we might not get everything right. But if we don't get strong viewership within the first day or so after uploading, the algorithm assumes that people aren't interested and start prioritizing other videos instead, which is ironic because the reason why people don't watch right away is that they don't even know that the video is out. So if you feel like we're delivering value, again, please turn on the notification bell. We're not here to waste your time with entertainment. As a matter of fact, we are in the process of building something right now that we think will add more value to you guys, all with the aim to be the go-to source for authentic, non-political news and insights on all things Asia. Together, we can and should cut through the mainstream media noise. Of course, I'm Stephen Park. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. And as always, stay curious.